Hey, so this is Miriam and this is Genesis, and today I wanted to tell you about how and why you would learn French in 18th century America. So, first of all, French would be this enormous prestige language for at least 100 years, right? It would be spoken at the court of Russia, the court of Holland. It would be, of course, spoken by the elites in France. So you would have very good reasons to learn it if you wanted to become a tradesman or a diplomat or anything that was a bit international in nature. So let's go back to the geographical problem of America. It is far from Europe, especially if you live in 18th century, which it would take like 2 months to cross the Atlantic. It was called like the crossing. It would take 2 months, so you would not necessarily feel that it was a given opportunity to visit France. But there were other reasons why people didn't necessarily want to have their children visit France at the time. So, for example, you had Thomas Jefferson, who was a big Francophile. He was famous for learning French really early and really liking it, and bringing back from France an enormous library of French-speaking books. But even Thomas Jefferson would say that France was not the ideal place to learn French because people in France were French, which at the time could mean a lot of things. First of all, it meant that they were not Protestants. And that was a big part of the American identity in New England, but also in Virginia. In Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson, it would be a problem because it would be seen as too, as they would call it at the time, too infected by popery, which is, a shorthand for Catholicism, because they did not respect the authority of the Pope in Protestant countries. So they would see France as a bit of a threat, a bit of a menace to the American identity. Oh! What? What's the problem? Anyway, you would have people like Thomas Jefferson and Silas Deane, who was an envoy to the court of France representing America, right before America was a thing, so during the Revolutionary War. So you would have this idea that France was a bit too Catholic in its sense, and a bit wrong in terms of religion. And on the other hand, you had this strong suspicion that French people were not religious enough. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson became an ambassador to France from 1784 to 1789, so right during the French Revolution, which absolutely matters because that's the moment when France became this rebel country, very, very much like the idea that France was out of control morally, that it was representing everything bad about modernity. They called it like the volcano of France that had exploded, or something like ungodly. So there was this strong suspicion that France was not a model in terms of morality and philosophy. You had this suspicion before and the beginning of the 18th century with Voltaire, Diderot, and a lot of other philosophers that... You okay with me? Let's move things. You would have this suspicion that France was a dangerous place for young people to go. That was something that people in England already had a suspicion about, and that's why they had a bearmaster, something like a chaperone, when they came to the Grand Tour in France. They had someone with whom they could speak French, and they could absolutely be protected against the influences of French people. So you had those two things, right? You had Catholicism, which was seen as a wrong interpretation of the Bible, which was putting the church above the Bible in Catholicism, and for Protestants it's the opposite. It's the Bible before the church. So what the Bible says is more important, which is why at the time Protestants had more incentive to translate the Bible in vernacular, normal languages that were not Latin or Greek. Whereas in Catholic countries it was not necessarily a thing. You would have very, very few people that actually owned a Bible in Spain, in France. That was not a thing. Because you always needed the interpretation of a priest, someone from the church telling you how to interpret things. And of course the idea was that you what happened? Yeah, so I said the idea was that for Catholic countries at the time, you would absolutely need the intervention of the church, some kind of authority to tell you if you were on the path to salvation or not. And Protestantism, in a lot of its manifestations, were the exact opposite, telling you that you had access to the Bible, you could read the Bible, and that could explain a lot about efforts to translate the Bible from liturgical languages like Latin or Greek or Hebrew, and make it available to people that were not necessarily educated but could read. And so in France you still have the Catholic tradition telling you that if you go to a church, it's going to be in Latin. You need some explanations, you need to have sort of barrier between what is said and how it's interpreted, and you need the church for both. This is the kind of thing where in Protestant countries like New England, so a lot of American countries at the time were pretty much more Protestants, and needed people to have Bible studies, Bible groups, something that is not really prevalent in Catholic countries at the time. You have two distinct cultures, and people from Protestant countries would call people from Catholic countries popist. It's like popery, this kind of idea, that disdain that these people were following a false idol, kind of. But people from Catholic countries had their own preconception against people from Protestant countries, and in France, for example, it was banned to practice any form of Protestantism, so it was the so-called Reform religion, and it was forbidden, except for some places where they were allowed to practice Protestantism. And those places were, for example, the Dutch chapel of the Dutch embassy in Paris, where it was possible to attend a French-speaking mass, which might have been one of the only places in France where it was legal. Why was it in French and not in Dutch? Because they wanted to let French-speaking Protestants from Paris, Orleans, anything from France, to come and attend and have a service in their own religion. So nowadays it's not that prevalent to have this big difference between Catholic countries and Protestant countries. It's more like in the architecture and things like that. But at the time you really had a different language, different way of owning a Bible or not. So many parents from Protestant countries were reluctant to have their children sent to France, they were way more comfortable sending their children to Switzerland, for example, where you have a strong Calvinist, so Protestant movement. They were more comfortable sending their children to Canada, which Thomas Jefferson actually recommended as a place to send your children to learn French, because in Canada they would speak French, and they would actually not have the massive Catholic presence. Of course, you would have a Catholic presence, but it was like a bit less dangerous than what it was in America, in France, sorry. So, how would you learn French in 18th century America, and why? And does it matter? Yeah, it matters. So first of all, I took the example of Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson loved French. He learned French at school. He was 9. It was not that easy to learn French at the time in America. You didn't have a lot of curricula that were designed for this. So he learned French, and what happened to him? He loved it. He loved it because he had access to a lot of books that were just published in French. And he cited some works of medicine, philosophy, political science, of course, because France was big on that. What Thomas Jefferson really liked about this is that he could read everything in the original language. So he recommended, even his nephew, Peter Carr, that he should absolutely learn French, because that's how one could be acquainted with the most important works in the modern world. But beyond that, beyond the fact that French was a language of prestige and a language of communication, what we call like a vehicular language, where people can talk, people from different native tongues can speak about different topics, especially science, political science. So to Thomas Jefferson, that was important. He told everyone around him that you have to learn French. This is the best language. You will have access to lots of books. And he's in France as an envoy, as an ambassador, and he buys a lot of books in French. He comes back from America. If I remember correctly, he's got like 80 boxes of French books. Some are in Latin, some are in different languages, but most of them are in French. And when there was the creation of the Library of Congress, he gifted those books, and there was some reluctance to accept those books, because those books were considered in a foreign language, but from a foreign language that had the reputation to be both Catholic but also immoral. And so it was rejected on the ground that those books could be immoral and even irreligious, which, at the time was quite the accusation to make. So Thomas Jefferson didn't necessarily know what to do with that, but he said, it's all or nothing. I either give you all of my books or none of them. And that's how the Library of Congress basically became what it is today, which is a trove of everything that you can hope for. So I think it's the biggest library in the world today. It's my dream to visit it. But yeah, it is partly thanks to Thomas Jefferson's refusal to have his books be accepted only in English, right? Anyway, so if you were to learn French at the time, you would have to go against these ideas that French was a dangerous language. Basically, it was a bit rebel because of Catholicism and because of Voltaire and other philosophers that made the language of French a bit heretic. Basically, you would have this suspicion that you were looking for something that was criticizing the religious mode of the time. And that became worse after the French Revolution, as you can imagine, because the French Revolution was just the proof that French people had lost their morality and had lost sight of what mattered. Why a country, you could wonder why a country like America, which had a revolution, would not be friend with a country like France that helped them during the revolution with the gunpowder, soldiers, found expertise, really, really a big ally for the American Revolution, right? You could wonder why they were so skeptical when it came to the French Revolution. So it was not always the case. At first they were like thinking, oh, they are doing their own thing, it resembles our revolution. But really quickly they really hated the anti-clerical laws, the anti-religious laws that seemed to go against their morality as Americans, because Americans already had this identity of being religious and being Protestants, so it was going against that. So obviously if you were to learn French in 18th century America, you would have a problem of people maybe judging you, maybe not being okay with you going to France, maybe not being okay with you having French books, was a bit suspicious. And yeah. So this is basically what you would have as a reaction to learning French, and that would not even get easier when you came, like for example, you were admitted to Harvard, which was very classical in its way of recruiting students. So you had to be very good at Latin, Greek, and you could have modern languages, but it was really on the back burner. It was not really important at the time at Harvard. It was very, very classical. So you would study a lot of Latin, not a lot of modern languages. And often Harvard, at the beginning of the 18th century at least, it was very, very reluctant to accept anything that had to do with French. You can still feel the kind of distrust when it came to French. Like literally they had a gift of books in French and they decided to refuse the books at Harvard because they said nobody reads French here, and they didn't have a proper tutor, they didn't have anything like a chair of French language at the time. And that's a big contrast. It was really, really different from what was happening in England when French was still studied at university, at school, by tutors, and that it was seen as a sign of elegance and refinement, but also worldliness. That was how you could have a career on the international level, to speak French. And of course there was a lot of distrust, but French was French. You had to speak it. And in America, because necessarily, I suppose, of the geographical distance, but also because of the maybe the ideological distance as well, French was seen as a prestige language that had a lot of really negative points. So I thought it was interesting. If you were a gentleman in 18th century, even if you went in America and you wanted to learn French, it was not that easy. That was not that easy. If you were a girl, it was a bit easier in terms of image, maybe, because you could still control what girls were going to do, but you also had this idea that, it's a loose, immoral language, so it was not easy. So next time, I absolutely want to explore how you would learn French if you were to stay in America in 18th century. What kind of books, what kind of tutors, and especially when it comes to the pronunciation, which was already a big, big problem. How would you learn how to pronounce a language you can't hear on a daily basis? How would you do that? And again, there was a massive, massive rupture between before the French Revolution, where France became a big ally for America. So there was a big Francophilia, still a bit of distrust, but still Francophilia. Like it was refined to read in French, and again, maybe not go to France, but still. And then after the French Revolution, you have the idea that no, France is really, really, really getting carried away. And there was a stop that was put between the relationship between America, the newly founded United States of America, and France. because of the undeclared naval war between the two nations. As far as I can tell, France was really guilty on this side of things, because you had an escalation, a purity spiral in France because of the French Revolution. So 1789 you had French Revolution, and then you had 1782 where it was like, who is the most revolutionary? Are you a bit bourgeois? Are you a bit aristocratic? And then it became worse and worse, to the point where it was basically a country that was at war with every other country. And at this time, curricula in American university stopped teaching French because it became so hostile between the two nations. So yeah, next time we'll talk about how you would learn French, what were the handbooks and what were the methods to learn how to pronounce French in 18th century America. And this was Mim, and this was Genesis, and I love her.